I am now going to try making up lost time by swiftly introducing you to our afternoon guest speaker. David Lewis is somebody we're very fortunate to have with us. David is a person who's been working in broadcast journalism, documentary making since 1982. He started out as an investigative reporter for CNN. Then he did investigative work for Peter Jennings. Eventually, in 2001, left CNN for 60 Minutes, 2020, CNBC, Bill O'Reilly with Fox, Frontline, CNN again. The poor guy obviously cannot keep a job. He also was this year nominated for a new piece he's done for CNBC, and it says on the biographical notes that David has given me, so pray for him December 4th. That's what the Emmys happen. He's also done a great deal of work in the Middle East, and that's really why he's here today. His work has included an extensive piece he did on Hizbullah that aired on Frontline. He's done a lot of work in Israel proper dealing with terrorism. He recently did a piece for CNBC on Paraguay that includes discussion of the fact that there's a Hezbollah angle in Paraguay, and turns out to be one of the largest funders of Hezbollah outside of the Middle East, to try word is reached in Paraguay. And wearing a completely different hat, very interestingly, David is also one of the co-founders of a group that's been here on campus, I believe, called Stand Up for Peace, whose credo is that
Comedy for Peace.
Comedy for Peace.
Different group.
Yeah, Comedy for Peace, whose credo is that if we can laugh together, we can live together. He's a very special guy. We go back a long way as it happens. And I'm very, very happy to bring you from Atlanta, David Lewis.
Greetings, or as we say in Atlanta, shalom, y'all. I want to thank Peter for inviting me to the Teach-in. It's an honor to be here. It's great to get out of a landlocked part of the country and see waves and walk mountains. It's really special. I do have one beef with Peter, though, which is I sent him a bunch of DVDs of various things I worked on. There was the incredibly pro-Israel reality series about how Israel fights terrorism. There was a CNN documentary about what Israel has to do to survive in combating terrorism, and then there was this film about Hizbullah. And of course, Peter said, "Do the film on Hizbullah. You know, the most controversial, the most uncomfortable, the one that you'll get the maddest at." So, thanks, Peter. So what I'm here to talk about is Hizbullah, about Israel and terrorism, and I actually will show some of that CNN film in the breakout session, so if you're mad at me after this, you'll like me after the next one. And Hizbullah is an organization which, for one reason or another, I've been a very close observer of over the last 6 years, since 9/11, essentially. A little more background on me. I'm a director-producer of nonfiction material, documentaries, and TV news magazine work. I happened to be in New York on 9/11 and essentially had the epiphany of, there's really only one thing that matters as a reporter right now, and that's the issue of terrorism and how America is going to deal with this. And I decided right then and there that I would try to spend as much of my time looking into issues of terrorism and trying to shed light, which is what reporters try to do, on that subject. So, as a storyteller, I set out to try to understand the complexities of a world that not only, my generation, but my children's generation would clearly be coping with. Al-Qaeda made it very clear that the Israeli-Palestinian struggle was one of their main focuses, and the U.S. made clear that Hezbollah was the next organization on its list, to quote Richard Armitage, who said, they're on the list and their time will come. He in fact described Hezbollah as the A team of terrorism and Al-Qaeda as the B team of terrorism, shortly after 9/11. I've been interested in the Lebanese-Israeli conflict since the very beginnings of my career in 1982. My first real job out of college was at the old ABC News documentary unit. And the first thing that I was asked to do, other than Xeroxing and running packages around New York, was to work on a film about the 1982 massacres that happened in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in Beirut of Palestinian elderly women and children, essentially. I didn't get to go to Beirut at that time. It would be 20 years before I would, almost 20 years before I would get to go. But that, ironically, was really the first real project that I worked on, and it gave me a great curiosity about clearly a very strange and difficult part of the world. So after 9/11, the first project which I really focused on was this project for Frontline World on Hizbullah, partially because of interest, but partially also through a variety of the kind of connections that an investigative reporter builds up over the years, because I thought I might be able to get some access to Hizbullah, which is not easy for an American journalist, especially television journalist, will leave aside the television Jewish journalist till later. I thought I could get some access through some interesting connections. And it just seemed very important, if indeed Hezbollah was the next target, was the next one on the list, that we ought to know who the hell these people were and what did they stand for. Because at that point, aside from the fact that they were bad, there was very little known, especially in this country, about Hezbollah, and it seemed to me a very worthwhile thing to try to make happen. I'd never actually been to the Middle East before 2001, and since then I've made 14 or 15 trips to Lebanon, Israel, Palestinian territories, and surrounding countries, but mostly Lebanon, Israel, and the Palestinian territories. And I'm going to show some brief clips from that film in a few minutes, but let's just talk a little bit more about Hezbollah. Again, just a little more background on the other trips that I made. I mentioned the CNN documentary, which was about how 5 different countries fight terrorism, and one of those sections was on Israel. There was the pilot for this reality series I mentioned about the daily dangers that Israel faces as seen through the eyes of Israeli soldiers and policemen on the front lines dealing with the daily threat of terrorism. I founded this organization called Comedy for Peace, which grew out of some of the really difficult times that I had as a Jew keeping my mouth shut in Lebanon and other places. And it was an interesting effort to try to get around how these two sides never see the same set of facts the same way, and trying to find another way to try to get people to talk to each other through comedy as opposed to through rational debate, because there is no such thing. When these sides talk to each other about a set of events, there is no rational conversation, there is no single truth, and comedy offered a hope as a way of trying to get in there, but that's another story. And then my most recent trip to the region was right after the war between Israel and Hezbollah, the summer before this past one, when I went there for Dan Rather for several weeks, just immediately after the war. And then, of course, there was this trip to the tri-border area of Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, looking at Hezbollah financing, among other subjects down there. So the point of this list of credits is not really to say that I'm someone who knows more than anyone else, but really just to say that I guess what I've done that's perhaps different is that I've spent a lot of time in these places, and I've gotten to know a lot of people. I have great friends on all sides of this place, from Abu Mazen's chief of staff to Ahmed Olmart's spokesperson. Both are good friends, people who I visit always, people who visit me when they're in the U.S. And I've been able somehow to, despite my own instincts on these issues, spend a lot of time on the ground and see things through the eyes of people who live them, not through books, not through speeches, not through ideology, but through facts on the ground. And my goal here is really just to inform and educate in whatever way I can. And perhaps my goal is simply to urge people here to see these terribly important, and to many of us really deeply personal, issues from a realistic from a facts on the ground point of view rather than an ideological point of view. I was far more ideological about Palestine, about Lebanon, and of course about Israel before I ever went there. And now, having spent a lot of time there, I simply want to find ways to create a better future for all sides, because a better future for all sides means, well, that my children and my tribe will be safer. If there's anything I've learned from my travels, it's to see this part of the world not from the way I would like things to be, but from the way they really are. I strongly believe it's the ideological prism on all sides that prevents a positive future from ever having a hope of emerging, and I hope, to help you see things from a realistic point of view as much as possible with such a difficult subject. Okay, Hizbullah. Last summer's war, Hizbullah started it. They crossed the border, attacked a military outpost, killed 5 soldiers, took two hostages back into Lebanon. Whether they're alive or dead, they have not had the decency to say. Israel responded mightily. They announced 3 immediate goals: get the soldiers back, stop the missiles that had started flying in, and crush Hezbollah once and for all. Now, which of those 3 did they achieve? None. Why? Why did a few thousand guerrillas with no tanks, no planes, no satellites, no helicopters, how did they manage to go toe-to-toe? They didn't win, despite their claims, but I think it's fair to say they had a tie with the vaunted Israeli Defense Forces. How did that happen? Today, Hezbollah has rearmed with better weapons. They've got a political stranglehold on the complex situation of Lebanese politics, and it's hailed throughout the Middle East as the first people to ever stand up to Israel. Israel, on the other hand, as we know, has been in a political freefall since then. It's a little stabler now, but as any student of Israeli politics knows, that doesn't last long. The IDF is probably in a period of soul-searching that hasn't happened in many, many years. And Hezbollah is strong, and in many ways, Israel is weaker. So how did this happen? I believe it's because Israeli political and military leadership saw Hezbollah the way they wanted to see it, and not the way they really are. I think they just said, okay, it's a terrorist group, and we can crush them. Well, it is a terrorist group, and it is a military organization, but whether we like it or not, that is not all they are. For the Shiites of Lebanon, historically the downtrodden, third-class citizens of that country, Hezbollah has earned their political support by providing social services that they never had before, by giving them honest politicians, which in a country where corruption is endemic, is something that has helped Hezbollah earn support, not because they paid for it, but because they've earned it. It's not comfortable to acknowledge that Hezbollah, with all of the American and Israeli blood that they spilled, are more than just terrorists, or even that they might have to be negotiated with. But the truth is that if Israel were to achieve its objectives of crushing Hezbollah once and for all, they'd have to kill all the Shiites in Lebanon, because there is no effective gap between Hezbollah and the Shiites, or the vast majority of Shiites. So Shiites are roughly 1/3 of the population there. That's about 1.5 million people that would have to be killed if you really want to crush Hezbollah. Don't think that's going to happen. Sorry. That's the truth. That's the way things really are. Again, whether we like it or not. That's Lebanon. That's what Israel somehow didn't understand. And that's why, out of those 3 main objectives, they achieved nothing, except great problems for Israel. It isn't the way we would like things to be, but if we fantasize or view reality through the ideological prism, you end up with a disaster like Israel's summer before last, or may I say you end up with Iraq, and where our country is today, where we fantasized about what we could achieve there. And I was one of them who was in favor of that war, and I bought into that fantasy too, and look what happened. These are complex and very emotional issues for many of us. For me, these aren't just theoretical issues of international affairs, but personal. If Israel's threatened, so are all Jews. It makes sense, given what's happened to Jews over the last several thousand years. It's easier somehow to be detached about US foreign policy and to see our extraordinary failures in Iraq than it is to gain an honest bird's eye view of Israel. Yet being detached is what allows hard choices to be made. All sides there are hot-tempered and passionate and have great pain they live with and danger far too close. But passion won't resolve anything, nor will expecting the other side to see things our way. So I hope to separate my own ideological beliefs and desires from facts and actions that are achievable. So one final point, and it's not necessarily a happy one, surprise, surprise. There's one, as I've spent so much time on all sides, there's a cultural difference that has really struck me about Israelis and their neighbors. It has to do with how each side sees history. Israelis are informed by the pain of our collective past, Jews and Israelis, but ultimately I believe are people who are willing to look forward and if peace is within grasp, leave the past behind, leave history behind. Try doing a business deal with Israelis from the United States and you'll see what I mean. It's completely hopeless. You've got to be there. In Israel, yesterday doesn't matter, only tomorrow does. It's just the way it is. Never again has many meanings to me. Of course, it means that the dark history of the Jews will not be allowed to be repeated, but it also means, at least to me, that Israelis will not make their future captives to the hard history of the Jews. Never again. But for so many Palestinians, Lebanese, and Arabs, history is everything. There can be no future unless past pains are accounted for. So in this fundamental way, it seems that these people will never see anything the same way. One group only looks forward while the other only looks back. So, yet, despite this cultural divide, there must be a way to find a solution that guarantees more peace and more dignity for all sides. I believe much of that has to do with accepting truth, acknowledging the facts, and seeing the struggle the way things really are. I have a great love for Israel, a fervent desire that it can live in peace with its neighbors and be there forever for my children and grandchildren. Yet loving Israel doesn't mean I'm blind to its mistakes any more than I can be blind to my own country's mistakes. In fact, for me, loving Israel requires that I help point out mistakes and mistakes of my own government in the region so they're not repeated. And if I have any goal today, it's to help people see the region, again, through that prism of often painful reality. Because I believe it's the only way Israel will ever have peace with its neighbors. Okay, so I'm going to show a few clips from the film about Hizbullah, and then take questions about Hizbullah or any of the other parts of my interesting and odd journeys in the region. So, and these are, just excuse me, these are just cut together from little pieces of the film, so it's a little, abrupt, but let's try this. My new sign language. Just over there, at the top of the hill, the militant Islamic. Julius Caesar called this place Heliopolis, the city of the sun. 2,000 years ago, the Romans built this temple to honor the god Jupiter. It was the largest temple in the Roman Empire, and the ruins are stunning.
was almost alone here. Tourists avoid this place because of its more recent history, as a haven for terrorists. Just over there, at the top of the hill, the militant Islamic group Hizbullah trained its fighters.
We're in the Bekaa Valley on our way to Baalbek, a Hizbullah stronghold. The Bekaa has been famous for many years for having terrorist training camps where terrorists from all over the world would come, and Hizbullah terrorists and others would train them, counterfeiting drug production like opium and hashish. Is that a Syrian position there? Syrian?
Syrian soldiers occupied this part of Lebanon. I had to stop at several checkpoints, both Syrian and Lebanese. Those are Syrian guns. They're aimed at Israeli fighter jets which cruise over Lebanon at will. Syria has about 20,000 troops in Lebanon, and they control this town. The late Syrian dictator Hafez al-Assad sent his army here during Lebanon's long civil war, and they never left. I came here at the end of Ramadan, the Muslim holy period. People were preparing to break their daily fast. Lebanon has a large Christian population, but 2/3 of the country is Muslim. Hikmat Sharif is a Lebanese reporter who showed me the back streets of Baalbek. This store sells Hezbollah souvenirs, like these icons of Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini, who once dreamed of exporting Islamic revolution here. This is Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's charismatic leader. They sell Hezbollah rally music here, and videos of Hezbollah guerrillas attacking Israeli soldiers.
This is perfume for the market.
This is Hezbollah perfume. It's called Perfume of the Martyrs.
See, that's the flags of Hezbollah and the pictures of all those people who died.
Martyrs are what Hezbollah calls their fighters who died attacking the Israeli soldiers who invaded and occupied Lebanon. Their images line the streets of Baalbek. Some of these men were suicide bombers. They would inspire Palestinian militants. At the edge of town, Hikmat showed me where in the 1980s Hezbollah used to hold Western hostages.
So behind that building was where they were keeping the hostages and
A
houses?
long time ago, they used to keep the hostages here. This is what they say.
And it was Hizbullah that was keeping them there?
Yeah.
The U.S. government now considers Hezbollah to be one of the world's most dangerous terrorist groups, backed by Syria and by Iran.
At the beginning, when the Hezbollah came here to Baalbek, the first place they came to this area.
This is the Iranian
The
Revolutionary
Iranian
Guard?
Revolution. They came here in 1981.
With weapons and money from Iran, Hezbollah, which means Party of God, became a major force in Lebanon in the 1980s. Suddenly, Hikmat pulled over.
You feel me?
This is one of the kidnappers? Is that what he said? It's one of the kidnappers?
Only in Baalbek. Hikmat had spotted a man who had hijacked a passenger plane back in the 1980s.
You're very lucky. This guy kidnapped the Jordanian plane and bombed it.
What?
They kidnapped it, they went to many Arabic countries, they bring it back, then they bomb it.
Beirut still bears the scars of its 17-year-long civil war between Christians and Muslims, but there are many more signs of change. Today, the city is eager to reclaim the reputation it once had as the Paris of the Middle East. restaurants, the tourists are back. This family from Bahrain invited me to join them.
We are here just to see the new Lebanon, because we hear that there's a new country coming, Lebanon, after the war, after the civil war. But something I have to tell you about Lebanon. Lebanon so far has no middle class, rich and poor. Where you find very rich people who can afford to spend as much as you think of, and poor who can even afford to eat.
This Palestinian refugee camp is not far from the newly westernized center of the city, but it's a world away. Here and throughout the country, Hezbollah gained legitimacy as the group that fought hardest against Israel's invasion of Lebanon. They're credited with finally driving out the Israelis after almost 20 years of a sometimes brutal occupation, and after nearly 20,000 Lebanese had died. I was able to negotiate my way into this Hezbollah political rally celebrating the anniversary of the Iranian Revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini gazed down upon his fellow Shiites. They chanted for the destruction of the Israeli state. The Secretary General of Hezbollah is Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah. Instead of the usual rhetoric about Israel, Nasrallah inveighed against the United States.
بأن الحرب الأمريكية على العراق ليس هدفها إنقاذ الشعب العراقي. الحرب الأمريكية على العراق ليس هدفها حماية الشعب الكويتي.
This rally was just before the war in Iraq.
وحكم العراق والأمريكان بدهم يستفيدوا من الإنجليز أن يقاتل الأمريكيين دفاعا عن هذا العراق.
Hezbollah's backers, Iran and Syria, have long been on the U.S. list of state sponsors of terror. Hezbollah was designated as a terrorist group in 1995. Ironically, in Lebanon, Hezbollah has been remaking itself as a mainstream political organization. They operate a satellite TV channel, which reaches an audience of 10 million people in the Middle East, second only to Al Jazeera.
Welcome to our news bulletin from Lebanon channel in Beirut.
It broadcasts news and entertainment, as well as propaganda like this.
Go hunt them down. This mighty nation.
But in Lebanon, they built a political organization. In recent years, it's become the second largest political party in the Lebanese parliament. Amr Moussaoui is one of their legislators. He started as a Hezbollah fighter. He was badly wounded. His brother was killed by the Israeli army.
أولاً أعتقد أن الكثير من الأمريكيين لا يدركون أن حزب الله هو حركة مقاومة لبنانية ضد الاحتلال الإسرائيلي.
What was your reaction to the attack on the World Trade Center September 11th?
طبيعي أن هذا العمل لا يقبله ضمير ولا عقل. ومن له مأخذ على السياسة الأمريكية.
Hezbollah has denounced American intervention in the Middle East, but Moussaoui's criticism of America was restrained.
أمريكا بلاد عظيمة لكن تحتاج إلى النظرة العادلة إلى قضايا العالم. بقدر ما تكون البلاد كبيرة وعظيمة ولديها مقدرات، قدر ما تصبح مسؤوليتها أكبر وأكثر دقة.
Hezbollah wants to show off their social programs, to show the world they are more than just fighters or terrorists. They took me on a tour of one of their hospitals, one of the best in Beirut, and they've been building neighborhood clinics. Hezbollah runs a network of schools and social service agencies, which has helped legitimize the group throughout Lebanon.
Do you know what's the name of this room? Greece. Yes. It's a kitchen.
For historically poor Shiite Muslims, this is real progress. But it's hard to ignore Hezbollah's ideology and what some believe is indoctrination.
The children who are educated through their schools are formed in a certain way, which is different from other Lebanese children. It is a recipe for trouble for Lebanon.
Mohammed Moghrabi was one of the very few Lebanese willing to talk critically of Hezbollah on camera.
Hezbollah is supposed to be a political party. In fact, it is an arm of the government. They are not subject to the rule of law and the principle of equal treatment under the law. They are more equal than other Lebanese.
I headed south to an area where the Lebanese army has no authority. This is where Hezbollah holds sway, in the most heavily Shiite part of the country. It's also where they won their greatest military victories against Israel, fighting for almost 2 decades until Israel withdrew in 2000. Their successful guerrilla tactics became a model for radical Palestinians. The United States wants the Lebanese army to replace the Hezbollah fighters along the border with Israel, but Lebanon has refused, unwilling to take on the Syrian Hezbollah alliance. A thin blue line of UN peacekeepers stands watch along the border, but as a Hezbollah fighter approached, it was clear who's in charge. It's quiet here now, but as the U.S. pushes all the parties, including Syria, towards a new Middle East peace plan, Hezbollah says they will follow their own path. Every year, Hezbollah shows off its muscle with a grand display of force on Jerusalem Day. Officially, like Iran, they reject Israel's right to exist. But the message is also that they'll defend their state here in Lebanon. Throughout my journey, I was told that to understand Hezbollah and its future, I should talk to this man. Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Hassan Fadlallah denies any official role, but is considered the spiritual leader of Hezbollah. Allegedly, he's the man who first gave religious approval to suicide bombings back in the early 1980s. I asked him if he had any regrets about all the blood that has been shed in Lebanon.
لكن أكدت أننا سوف ندافع عن أنفسنا بكل قوتنا ولن نقف مكتوفين الأيدي، وهذا حق طبيعي إنه إذا ما هاجمتنا أمريكا وإسرائيل أو أي دولة تريد أن تنال من صمودنا وتنال من حقنا.
Take questions now. Testing. So I really just want to take questions and try to get to whatever I can to scratch whatever itches you have. And Peter will be the question maestro.
Wow, this is hot. I also, because I know that a lot of people have questions, and I want to try and get in as many as I can. I'm going to ask people to keep their questions short and concise, and I'm going to ask David, except when the mood takes him, to keep his answers short enough that we can get a lot of you in. So, Rabbi Allison.
Two quick questions. One, I'd be curious to hear the response of the sheikh to your question that you asked. I'd love to know the answer. And the second question is, did you ever ask them, the last quote that was out there was the man saying that, will we have a right to defend ourselves under any attack? And have you ever put to them, well, what about Israel? Do they have the same right?
I asked a lot of, in answer to the second one, I asked a lot of questions like that. With Sheikh Fadlallah, one of the first questions was, I had for him was equating, looking at the whole issue of suicide bombing. Well, first I asked him about 9/11. He said it's a terrible thing. Innocents shouldn't be killed. And I said, what about innocents on buses, on Israeli buses? And he said, oh no, that's an action-reaction thing. So he didn't go there. Amr Musawi at the end, I don't remember whether I asked that specific question or not, but I asked versions of that all the time. And with Hizbullah, they're very, there's quite often quite a large gap between the public hot rhetoric of Hassan Nasrallah and the much quieter, much calmer, compromise might be possible kind of rhetoric that you sometimes get in one-on-one conversations. And Amr Musawi and Fadlallah both said something along the lines of, well, if Israel stops picking on us, we'll have peace in 10 seconds, kind of thing. You can take it for whether you think that's true or not.
Right.
Yeah.
I have a question regarding Syrian presence in Lebanon.
Well, this is a film from 5 years ago, so just, it's obviously outdated in terms of that aspect of it.
Yes, has there ever been a reaction from the world community, if you will, regarding the Syrian presence in Lebanon and its effect on Israel's responses?
I don't really know the answer to that question, honestly. Certainly, there were many resolutions. The U.S. Lebanese-Syrian Accountability Act that was passed in the U.S. Congress. There were various measures over 20 years designed to push Syria out. Whether the specific thing about whether Syria's been held to account for its actions or in Lebanon and how they impact Israel, I don't know the answer.
Question about your personal safety. Jewish journalist, what happened to Daniel Pearl? Really, how do you make the decisions?
I actually knew Danny because he was his first job for the Wall Street Journal was in Atlanta, and we knew each other there. This is a tricky one, and my wife is in the corner, so I'm trying to figure out whether I tell the truth or not. There have been a lot of interesting moments. I mean, when I first got access to Hizbullah, as you can imagine, it's not an easy thing to get. You just don't dial 1-800-Hizbullah and, say, dudes, I'm on my way. It's a very protracted thing, and I actually, the first time I attempted to get access, they refused to give me the access I wanted unless I signed what they described as a little piece of paper saying that I would agree to be an objective journalist. Okay, no problem. Of course, a little piece of paper turned out to be a 5-page legal contract that, basically said they could take my firstborn if I didn't do what they wanted. So I said, essentially, no, not going to do it. And they were very surprised. And they said, David, everybody signs this piece of paper. And I said, have any American journalists signed it? And they said, no, you would be the first. And I could just see my friend Bill O'Reilly, going, PBS signs contract with terrorist group. And so I said no, and they were very surprised, and then I had to get access. But, one of the questions, thank goodness my name is, Lewis and not Goldstein or Greenberg, just by happenstance. Original family name was Oshinsky. There was the question, David, it's Jewish name, right? And I said, oh no, David Lewis is a traditional Welsh name, which it is, just not in my case. So, there've been a lot of moments like that. I mean, I was, when I was there, summer before this past one, right after the war, the first night of Rosh Hashanah coincided with the Hizbullah victory rally with Hassan Nasrallah and me and a half of his best friends and one Jew. And I was there, and it was, it's even for me that was a particularly peculiar day. But to boil down to the safety question, and there have been a lot of tough moments. I mean, I've been out on patrol with Israeli sniper teams in the West Bank, and those are also pretty hairy. But I actually feel much more secure with Hizbullah than I ever do in the Palestinian territories. Hizbullah are a very centrally controlled, efficient, disciplined organization. When they say no, you can't have access, that means no. When they say yes, it means yes, and you will not be touched. I mean, even now I go into Beirut, I go into the Hizbullah neighborhoods just to, go to my favorite gift shops and get odd items that customs always looks somewhat oddly at when I come back into the country. But in the Palestinian territories, there's so many different groups. Who controls which block on which day is so unpredictable that I always feel, much more at risk in Gaza or Ramallah or places like that. But the one thing that I do, and I would never go into any of these places without, is that, and it is the mistake that Danny Pearl made, is, in the Arab culture, if you're a friend of a friend, you're untouchable. And I go into these places with, friends who I know they trust. I was a journalism fellow, something called a Neiman Fellow, a number of years back, and one of the other fellows in the program, it's a year-long thing, was a Palestinian woman reporter who grew up, still lives in the old city, knows everybody, knows me. I trust her with my life. And when she goes, I don't go to those places unless she's with me, or one of her friends is with me, or somebody who I know will be able to hold whoever might do something to me accountable within their own culture. And in Lebanon, I do versions of the same.
You were there right after the Lebanon war. What is the fear? I mean, I had friends who had just come back. Some of them who were real mean. I mean, they were, just not really have been involved in the whole, the unpreparedness. Could you speak a little bit about that?
From the Lebanese, I mean, I was only on the Lebanon side. I wasn't on the Israeli side after the war.
Can you repeat the question?
The question is, if I understand it, right after the recent Hezbollah-Israel war, what were things like? I think is in essence the question. I haven't been to Israel since that war, unfortunately, but on the Lebanese side, several things. I mean, one, the general perception, I think, here is that Lebanon was flattened by Israel during that war. Nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, there are particular neighborhoods in Beirut. The Al-Manar building, that television station that I was at, that's gone. The block where Hassan Nasrallah's headquarters was, and of course he always moved around, but in the same general area, that block is gone. A building here, a bridge there. Downtown Beirut, the party never stopped. The people are still dancing on tables, the restaurants are still wonderful. The rest of the country is completely untouched, except for, again, specific areas. I was out in Baalbek, the same area where I was where we ran into that hijacker, and I also was again with my friend Hikmat. And again, Baalbek is a very strong Hezbollah area, but it was a neighborhood here, a building there, pinprick. Of course, on the southern border with Israel, those towns I think probably are flat, and certainly the pictures I've seen, there's much wider devastation. But I want to make a larger point about
the water that I see standing on the table, they were complaining, several of my friends were in the army, and I don't know.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, clearly in terms of the Israeli army and their mistakes in the war, their logistics planning was awful, and there was stuff like that, lack of training, lack of appropriate weaponry, bullets. I mean, there were all kinds of problems in terms of how Israel prosecuted that war, starting with the fact they should never have done it in the first place. But that's another question. I think there's one point that I found very interesting, which was right after the war. Well, during the war, I have a radio show in Atlanta where my assignment is to interview anybody you want about anything, and so I call friends, and I called my favorite taxi driver in Tel Aviv, and I asked him what the war was like from his side, and I called some other friends in Israel, and I called friends in Lebanon, and I called my best Christian friend there, a guy who's really opened so many of the doors that I've been able to go through in Lebanon, and I said, Gabby, Hezbollah started this war. How are you feeling about it? He said, David, we were so mad at Hezbollah. Not just the Christians, not just the Sunnis, not just the Druze, but the Shiites were mad at Hezbollah. We were so furious. We'd spent all these years, 15 years, rebuilding our country after the Civil War. And these, I'm going to quote him, these fuckers have ruined it. They've ruined it. They've ruined our country again. But then, David, you know what happened? After a week of Israeli bombing, and after 2 weeks, and after 3 weeks of Israeli bombing, and Lebanese kids were dying, we forgot we were mad at Hezbollah. We forgot who started this war, and we were just mad at the people who were dropping the bombs. And I thought that was a really poignant point, because the way Israel prosecuted that war had the absolute opposite result of what they wanted, which was to crush Hezbollah. If they had responded proportionally, made Hezbollah pay a price, they would have lost their political power, which in the end is the most important thing to them. But instead, because the war went on for so long, and so ineffectively, dropping of these millions of cluster bombs at the very end of the war, for what purpose? So that, it just was insane. But the reality is now that much more of Lebanon is pro-Hezbollah than ever was before.
This man over here has had his hand up for a long time, and the woman next to him.
Since you work at CNN, you can defend them or explain their actions. I've never seen your video before, but what I did see by way of the YouTube was, it was called God's Warriors, where they documented Christian, the Muslims and the Jews. And from what I saw, what they showed of the Jews, they took the 3 radical Jews from the last 100 years and made it sound like, all of us have weapons in the closet. Can you explain that exactly?
Well, I haven't worked at CNN for 6 years, but you can call my friend Andy Siegel, who's in my synagogue, who was the producer of the section on the Israelis, and talk to him about it. I think, I saw the Muslim portion, and I saw the Jewish portion of that 6-hour Christian Amanpour film, or 3-hour, I don't remember what it was way too long, whatever it was. I think that we're hypersensitive to criticism. I think that film, had some stuff that I didn't like, but I didn't think it was false stuff. Those were real people who said some pretty outrageous things. And I think that, we, my team, are hypersensitive to criticism, and I don't think it's helpful. I think it was overall a pretty balanced report. It's never going to say exactly everything we want, but that's my reaction to that. Follow?
I think a lot of this has to do with perception, especially in the international media. It seems that Israel lost the war last year in terms of the PR war, and that's where Hezbollah got a lot of the advantage over us. And in response to what you're saying, you could make a movie about Jewish terrorists, and maybe it'd be 3 minutes long, but you could do a documentary about all the other terrorists, have to go on for a couple of days.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. I don't buy the whole argument that, a suicide bombing is the same as, Israeli military. People try to put that one on me all the time, and I'm sorry. I don't go there. The whole PR thing is of course different. Israel is a democratic state with a free press, and what comes with that is a lot of tough reporting. In Lebanon, that's not the case. The press there is owned by somebody or other from a particular party or group or, family even. And so reporting there, you have to, there are great Lebanese English language websites where you can read the Lebanese dailies every day, as I do, but you always have to understand, okay, who owns it? Why don't they say anything critical of this, that? Anyway, but there's no question that propaganda is a lot easier when you don't have a democracy on one side.
Before I call you as a I've talked to a number of journalists, our old classmates, about this. You as you have one set of goals and one set of values, and you as a journalist have certain values, objectivity, certain requirements. There are not always this intention between the two of them. Can you articulate that tension and how you resolve it in terms of your desire to do good as a journalist and as a Jew?
No, I can't. Simply put. Well, I mean, there are projects that I've worked on which are stridently pro-Israel. I don't regard them as news projects. I regard them as there's one reality series that I tried to make happen and got as far as the sort of sample reel pilot stage. I don't see those as journalism. When you're there as a reporter, you have to try and as much as you humanly can put your own feelings in your pocket. It is impossible, and inevitably we see things through some kind of a personal lens. But you have to try and cope with it as best you can, and it's just always very hard. I mean, to me, the real thing that annoyed me about the coverage of the Lebanon War was the gap between the way it was portrayed and then the reality when I got there, which was, people made it. The press always focuses on the building that's come down, the person that's died. That's inevitably what they're going to do, and that on both sides. But you certainly got a much better sense on the Israeli side that there was missiles were coming in and things were going on, but that for the most part, life was going on. You didn't get that sense on the Lebanese side, and partially that's because the press was very tightly controlled there. Hizbullah had minders and everybody, and took people, where they would let them go, and I could go on about that forever. But essentially, in terms of objectivity, all you can really do is try to contain your own beliefs as best as you can.
I was actually going to ask you a similar question, like as a journalist, when you're interviewing someone that you disagree with, is it hard to contain that? Like, I saw when you shook the hand of the spiritual leader of Hizbullah, the voiceover said this was the first man to support suicide bombers. I would have been able to shake his hand, or wanted to touch him, or be in the same room with him.
It's very hard, but that's what you do as a journalist. You don't necessarily talk to only people whose opinions you like. Sometimes you have to talk to people whose opinions you hate. And when you're doing that, if you want to get an honest interview, you can't, refuse to shake their hand. You've asked them to tell, the story from their perspective, and you have to show them common courtesy. It isn't necessarily something you like to do, but it is something, however, you have to do if you want to get to hear the other side.
And also on that, so I noticed you said my friends, these people, my friends, these people, they all, like, do you seriously feel like they're all your friends, or some of them, are they just people that you're aware you should be on better terms with in order to be able to get into a certain sect?
No, I actually have friends as well. No, I mean, my friends are, on the Lebanese side are mostly Maronite Christians. I mean, that's because they have the best food and the most style. I'd much rather hang out with them than, with others because, it's more fun. And some of those people are helpful in getting the access to something or other, but really I just like to hang out with them. On the Israeli side, I have friends, I have TV people. The woman who brought the telenovela to Israel is a great friend of mine. Olmert's spokesperson is a really dear friend of mine. They're people from all walks of life, and sure, they're professional contacts who if I want to try to get in to see someone at Shin Bet or someone in the IDF or go out on patrol with a sniper team or whatever it is. Yeah, they're people I deal with on a purely professional level. It doesn't mean I'm going to go hang out with them or go to their house for Pesach, which I've been fortunate enough to do in Israel. So, all types.
Over here, and then we'll go.
When you write a story and you're getting ready to edit it, is that the time that you sit down to try to be unbiased?
You try and do it throughout the entire process, and it's an eternal struggle. I mean, this film was particularly hard because there's such hot feelings. I was very glad afterwards that I was accused of being both Hezbollah agent and a Zionist spy. So I felt that I had it right if I was being accused sort of equally of rooting for the other team in both directions. But it's an eternal struggle, whether it's what you decide to shoot, what question you decide to ask, what picture you do show, what picture you don't show, what you edit, what you write. It's just, it's a constant struggle.
So you started by saying what we shouldn't do, the Israelis and the Hizbullah, in order to solve the problem. And I'm curious to know what you think we should do in order to solve it.
Journalists only get to make comments without having to be held accountable. That's a very big question, and we could spend the rest of the day answering that one. In terms of, you're asking in terms of Lebanon and Hezbollah specifically, I think. I think with Hezbollah that we've missed some very important messages that they've given out and refused to listen to them because of their past. I mean, the Bush administration has made it very clear that, we will not talk to certain people. And, James Baker's reports basically said, that's really stupid. How do you ever get anywhere unless you talk to people? Hezbollah have an extraordinarily bloody history. They have appalling rhetoric. They are bad people. But they are people with a lot of power, whether we like it or not. So I think that they have to be dealt with. They have to be talked to. There have been some interesting signs long before the war, which again they started for whatever reason, and Nasrallah made it clear that he had no idea that it would generate the response that it did. Incredibly stupid on his part, but about 6 months before the war, in I think January or February of 2006, Nasrallah signed a memorandum of understanding with one of the main Maronite political leaders, a guy named General Michel Aoun. And in that memorandum of understanding, he said that, he signed his name to it, that Lebanon should get rid of the confessional system and have one man, one vote. That the diaspora Lebanese, who are almost all Christian, should be able to vote. In other words, giving Christians a lot more political power than they currently have. There was references to how they might go about giving up their arms. They were talking about exchange of prisoners with Israel. There were multiple references to Israel in this document. For Hassan Nasrallah to sign a document that says Israel and not Zionist entity is a huge thing. Nobody paid attention. Throughout this document, there was resolution of the Shebaf arms issue, and so on and so on and so forth. But because it was Nasrallah, because it was Hezbollah, and people rejected it and paid no attention. And Aoun, who I personally think is the most interesting and the most truly democratic leader in that country, has been utterly rejected as a sort of stooge of the Syrians and a pro-Hezbollah, and I think he's the guy who we should be dealing with. I mean, he's somebody that I know personally, and he asked me for some advice at one point about how to approach the American press, and I went to see him, and the first thing that I said to him was, look, you got to understand something, General. I'm a Jew, okay? I'm a Jew. I can't be helpful to you if that's going to somehow bounce back on you. Aoun controlled by the Jews. And he said, David, it's not a problem.